Good morning, Little Masters, and welcome back to today's Tolkien Times. I'm the Man of the West, also from the Prancing Pony podcast. Let's keep week 26 going with today's Third Age Thursday, a time for us to revisit those familiar and not so familiar stories of the Third Age. Now, in Series 3, we spent all 8 weeks going through the Appendix on Durin's Folk and the Quest of Erebor from Unfinished Tales. Now, some might say that's a long time to spend with just dwarves. So we're moving on in Series 4 to cover something that I think we all have reason to get excited about, the origin story of Rohan. Now, with the December release of the War of the Rohirrim already on the minds of many in the Tolkien fandom, I thought this would be a great time to spend the next 8 weeks going through the story of Cirion and Eorl from Unfinished Tales, if for no other reason than to give us the background before we visit the story that the film will tell, that of Helm Hammerhand, the ninth king of Rohan. So let's dive in. The Chronicle of Cirion and Eorl begins only with the first meeting of Cirion, steward of Gondor, and Eorl, lord of the Émo-théod, after the battle of the field of Celebrant was over and the invaders of Gondor destroyed. But there were lays and legends of the great ride of the Rohirrim from the north, both in Rohan and in Gondor, from which accounts that appear in later chronicles, together with much other matter concerning the Émo-théod, were taken. These are here drawn together briefly in chronicle form. The Émo-théod were first known by that name in the days of King Calamechtar of Gondor, who died in the year 1936 of the Third Age, at which time they were a small people living in the Vales of Anduin, between the Carrack and the Gladden fields, for the most part on the west side of the river. They were a remnant of the Northmen, who had formerly been a numerous and powerful confederation of peoples living in the wide plains between Mirkwood and the River Running, great breeders of horses and riders renowned for their skill and endurance, though their settled homes were in the eaves of the forest, and especially in the East Bight, which had largely been made by their felling of trees. These Northmen were descendants of the same race of men as those who in the First Age passed into the west of Middle-earth and became the allies of the Eldar in their wars with Morgoth. They were, therefore, from afar off, kinsmen of the Dunedain, or Númenóreans, and there was great friendship between them and the people of Gondor. They were, in fact, a bulwark of Gondor, keeping its northern and eastern frontiers from invasion, though that was not fully realized by the kings until the bulwark was weakened and at last destroyed. The waning of the Northmen of Rhovanion began with the Great Plague, which appeared there in the winter of the year 1635 and soon spread to Gondor. In Gondor, the mortality was great, especially among those who dwelt in cities. It was greater in Rhovanion, for though its people lived mostly in the open and had no great cities, the plague came with a cold winter when horses and men were driven into shelter and their low wooden houses and stables were thronged. Moreover, they were little skilled in the arts of healing and medicine, of which much was still known in Gondor, preserved from the wisdom of Númenor. When the plague passed, it is said that more than half of the folk of Rhovanion had perished, and of their horses also. They were slow to recover, but their weakness was not tested for a long time. No doubt the peoples further east had been equally afflicted, so that the enemies of Gondor came chiefly from the south or oversea. But when the invasions of the Wain Riders began, and involved Gondor in wars that lasted for almost 100 years, the Northmen bore the brunt of the first assaults. King Narmakil II took a great army north into the plains south of Mirkwood, and gathered all that he could of the scattered remnants of the Northmen, but he was defeated, and himself fell in battle. The remnant of his army retreated over the Dagorlad into Ithilien, and Gondor abandoned all lands east of the Anduin, save Ithilien. As for the Northmen, a few, it is said, fled over the Celduin, River Running, and were merged with the folk of Dale under Erebor, with whom they were akin. Some took refuge in Gondor, and others were gathered by Marhuini, son of Marhari, who fell in the rearguard action after the Battle of the Plains. Passing north between Mirkwood and Anduin, they settled in the Vales of Anduin, where they were joined by many fugitives who came through the forest. This was the beginning of the Émo-théod, though nothing was known of it in Gondor for many years. Most of the Northmen were reduced to servitude, and all their former lands were occupied by the Wain Riders. Now, there are a few things to add to all this. First, that bit about the Northmen being a far-off kinsman of the Dunedain, Tolkien explained in a note that they were most akin to the third and largest house of the Edain, ruled by the House of Hador. Now, Tolkien described that house as strong, tall, bold, and steadfast, fair-skinned with golden hair and blue eyes. Huor and his son Tuor are classic examples of the House of Hador, and I think we can see that in the Rohirrim. Now, in the notes, Christopher observes that it is an interesting fact, not referred to, I believe, in any of my father's writings, that the names of the early kings and princes of the Northmen and the Éo-théod are Gothic in form, not Old English or Anglo-Saxon, as in the case of the later Rohirrim. He gives several examples, pointing out that both Marhuini and Marhari include the Gothic word marh, meaning horse, which is cognate with Old English mer, plural meras, the word we know from the Lord of the Rings that's used to describe the royal horses of Rohan. Now, he explains that since the Rohirric language was meant to sound like Old English, their ancestors' names would, of course, be in the forms of the earliest recorded Germanic language. Now, that does it for this week's Third Age Thursday. Come back next week for more on the Northmen. Please visit patreon.com/TolkienTimes to learn how you can support the show, get an ad-free feed, a monthly hangout, and a bonus weekly episode, and more. And join me again tomorrow on today's Tolkien Times as I welcome a special guest for Fandom Friday. Now, if you're watching this on YouTube, please like, subscribe, turn on notifications, and please follow or subscribe in your podcast apps. And everybody, please follow @Tolkien Times on all your social media. And then, as Faramir says, go with the goodwill of all good men.